Sorry for the late start, everybody. But welcome to our first resume workshop. I know a lot of us are coming off of our very first fall reading week, so hopefully you guys have the time to relax and enjoy that before coming back to school. Luigi kind of gave a quick introduction and of who's going to be here tonight, as well as the event, but I'm just going to give another quick overview. So tonight, of course, is all about improving your resume. As you guys know, the better your resume, the better chance you'll have at hearing back to receive an interview. And obviously there's a lot of other factors that kind of play into that, but resume oftentimes is your very first introduction to the company or group that you're applying for. So ideally, you guys can use information that you've received tonight and bring it forward to your mentor as well for additional polishing to help with your career search. I know a lot of us third years are pursuing PUI. We have fourth years trying to enter into the professional industry and find their first real full-time position, or even first and second years very keen on a summer position. So we hope that this is all useful for you guys. To start, I'll just reintroduce our speakers tonight. So we have Tia Perek. She was a U of T alumni, which is great, majoring in human resources and economics, and she's currently the head of North American human resources at Plenary Americas. Just to give you guys some context, Plenary is a long-term investor, developer, and manager of public infrastructure. We also have Luigi. Some of you guys may have seen him before. He's a civil engineering IT4 plus PUI graduate and the director of Plenary Americas and also the chair of our program. So with that, I'll pass it off to Tia and Luigi.
Thanks, Max. Tia, I'm sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Do you want to just give a quick overview of your experience in human resources, maybe just some general notes before we jump into the tips?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me on this workshop. Just to go back on my experience, so I am a U of T grad, and very happy to be here tonight. And I've worked in a lot of different industries. So I started off in the tech sector, specifically focused on recruitment. So just going through cycles of resumes, hiring new grads, and hiring more senior level professionals as well. And then made my way over to pharmaceuticals, banking, and now I'm in the infrastructure finance field working with Luigi. So fortunately, I've had a lot of exposure to different industries and looking at so many different resumes of different professions. And over the last probably decade, I don't want to age myself too much, but I've seen a lot, and there have been some consistent themes on what speaks to HR, what resonates with leadership in terms of what they want to see from candidates. So I'm just hoping to relay as much of that feedback and any tips to all of you to help you in your journey as well as you apply for jobs.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's anyone more qualified to come to help help now, given the amount of experience Tia has. Again, not aging ourselves, but we definitely look at a lot of resumes at Plenary, and we try to hire the best of the best. And Tia has done an amazing job of doing that so far. So why don't we just jump into it? We're going to go over first just some general tips and guidelines for resume writing, and then we're going to take I think about 3 resumes that were submitted to us and go through them and just highlight some very specific examples of things that could be better or improvements that could be made. So Max, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide and we'll get started. So Tia, I figured we'll just have a conversation about these because I'm sure there's an anecdote or there's an example behind every one of these points. When I was writing my resume for Plenary and I was in school, I didn't have a lot of experience. I had done some PUI, but I really didn't have a lot to demonstrate what I was capable of doing. But I did, having worked in engineering consulting, I did find it really, maybe slightly easier to quantify the impact I had. If I was, working on a construction project, I can quantify what, my engineering analysis had done. Is that where you're getting with your first point? Try and quantify the impact of what you've done on previous jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of words on a resume, and it's very easy to say, I helped with this and I led this. But really what employers want to see is, do you understand the economics of a job as well? So for example, I'll give a very, very simple example. Unlike you, Luigi, I didn't even have that experience. I worked in retail before I entered the HR career. And so to be able to show, well, what in retail did I possibly do that resonates with HR? So even talking about the number of people I trained, right? So if there's new staff, as someone that's been working at that retail company for 4 years, I was able to train 6 people when they came on board. That's just an example. Or looking at how much I increased the sales. Now, not all of these quantifiable facts are going to be directly related to that role you apply to, but it does demonstrate to the employer that I understand numbers, I understand the importance of sales, and I may not be selling in my role, but at least I understand the economics of, you know, profitability, which is going to be important in any business you work for. Yeah. So I think it's important to, you know, you don't want to over quantify where you're really stretching it, but it's good to be able to demonstrate that objective evidence versus just anecdotal for your entire resume.
Agreed. And Max, like, feel free to chime in, but I went over your resume, and, you know, you're obviously very qualified. You worked, you know, jobs that you would have before you start your career, right? You know, working at a pizza restaurant, working at an ice cream restaurant, right? But even though I remember reading your resume and being really impressed, because the things that you did there, they were still very quantifiable and they demonstrated leadership. So I think no matter what your experience is, you know, try and highlight what you've actually done. Don't just dismiss it as not being applicable, because that's not the case. Would you agree, Max?
No, I definitely agree. Like, obviously, like, a lot of the jobs that I've worked over the summers have not really been related to engineering, right? And so I was kind of hesitant to put them on the resume because in my mind, it didn't make sense. But at the same time, if you can quantify what you do, then it's kind of impressive to show that even if you're not in the field that you want to enter into, like, you add value wherever you go, right? And so, like, for example, like, I mean, I worked at an ice cream shop in the summer, and it's not, I mean, the most prestigious position, but one of the things that I ended up doing was implementing, like, a debit tipping system, because like, the customers always said, oh, I would like to tip you guys, and I'm kind of unhappy that your owners don't have, like, this in place. And so we made sure that we could, like, do that through Skule. And so for me to be able to say, like, that ended up increasing all of our wages by, like, 15%. So I just kind of quickly did that by looking at, like, my payroll, right? And that's something that, I mean, might add value to the resume if you want to end up putting that experience on. So I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, and that's, like, to the fourth point, as a transferable skill, being analytical, being able to understand the problem and put together a solution. Like, that's what employers are looking for. The last bullet point reminds me of a funny story in high school. They were trying to prep us for putting resumes together for summer jobs as we go into university. And my teacher at the time asked a student, what did you do over the summer? And he said, oh, I drove the golf cart to get the golf balls. He's like, no. You were a spherical retriever and coordinator at the golf course. He was just, like, trying to talk up what he did using fancy words. I would say that employers can usually see through that, like, try and make it seem as straightforward as possible. But Tia, what's your thought on that? Can you tell if someone's trying to, like, really jazz up something?
Yeah, you can. And I think there's a really fine art and balance there where you don't want to oversell yourself and you're really stretching limits, because they will ask you questions or follow up on that. So, you know, it really just be objective as much as you can, but you don't want to stretch it with too many fancy words either. So I think you just have to find that right balance.
Yeah. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Max. So what do you think here, Tia? Like, the align, do you want to walk through the first point, or maybe a couple points, and we can just chat about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the objective statement is a very common thing to see in resumes, particularly for new grads. So to be honest, it's often viewed as a filler area of your resume. Doesn't often add too much, but as a new grad, you already have such limited experience, so you're trying to showcase as much as you can. So I think in that case, an objective statement is okay. You want to make sure it's not filler or vague words. You want to make sure it's not saying you're responsible and you're friendly. If you got into university, you know, it's pretty obvious that you're pretty responsible. So try to really critically think of, if that is especially at the beginning of your resume, what is going to be a standout statement for employers or recruiters to look at. And I find the best way is really to look at the job posting and then try to align your objectives so it's very catered to that position.
Yeah, I've been telling I typically recommend the objective statement to mentees, because I feel like it summarizes and it's identifiable, maybe something easier to remember. do you think that's the case? I could be completely wrong, but do you think that it's easier to remember someone with an objective statement, or do you think it's like kind of irrelevant and it's really showing to put it as a filler?
The problem is, I think it depends on the audience. So if you're sending it directly to hiring manager, it's okay. But when you're applying to these mass job postings, the people that are screening these resumes are looking at thousands for that job posting. So they're really going down straight to your experience, who has the most relevant experience. They're not even going to look at your objective, to be completely honest with you. But with that being said, if you have limited experience and you have maybe 1 to 2 sentences that is a really standout summary of you and your profile, then it will sit well, it will resonate, but it's something that's often skimmed over when it comes to reviewing resumes.
Okay. I've heard a bunch of times that, large companies, they don't even read them in the first round. They just put them through a computer program and try and find keywords. Is that the case?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I went back to look at the job posting and really try to cater it, because if you have those keywords pop up, that's the only way you're even going to get through a short list and get past the machine.
Got it. So that's just taking the career post or taking the job posting and then finding associated words with that. So if they're looking for someone who's analytical, you would be like demonstrated analytical ability doing X, Y, Z.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you think we should talk about on this page?
I guess the one area we'll talk about is skills. Skills is really important to include, especially if you have technology, software experience, foreign language, all of that. I would just be careful not to include, again, skills like interpersonal skills or teamwork skills. Again, some of the things that can be obvious, for example, if you've gone through university education, you probably have worked on team projects, you've done independent work, and you probably have leveraged interpersonal skills. They can probably pick up on that through those kind of things versus taking up that space. So you want to make sure when you're talking about skills, it's actual concrete things that you've taken on or learned.
Right. When you see, so like if you were a student and you saw a job posting, what would be your process for actually putting together a resume in response to that?
If I saw a job posting?
Yeah.
So I've been working for so many years, so I have my template that I go to, but what I always do is study the job posting and then actually make notes. So beside each job responsibility of that particular role, I write down, where do I have any sort of transferable skills? And for some of them, I may not, and that's okay. But for the bullet points where I actually have transferable skills, I'll now go back to my resume and say, does my resume actually reflect that? Does it show that? It's a lot of work, but if you are going to take the time to apply, you got to show the effort, and the effort will show when, they're reviewing thousands of resumes or hundreds of resumes and they're picking yours.
Yeah. And I've received this question a couple of times from mentees, but cover letters, what are your thoughts on them? Do they need, does it really make a difference? Are they important for smaller companies versus bigger companies? If you're sending a cold email, do you think you need to have them? What are your thoughts generally on them?
Yeah, I think that if you are doing cold emails, I would include it. If job postings are asking for it, include it. As a new grad, I generally would include it just because you don't have as much direct experience. So you want to be able to show through writing or through a narrative how you may still be the ideal candidate, even though you don't have the full 1 or 2 years of experience. What you will realize down the road in your career is that there's no need to do a cover letter because your resume will have enough experience to speak for itself. So I think for the purpose of this audience, I would still recommend a cover letter. But as you start to build your experience, to be honest, we don't look at it that often.
Yeah. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide, Max. Unless there's anything else you want to talk about on that slide, Tia.
No, it's good.
Okay. So research, what we just talked about, this is basically like the conversation we just had, so we can go to the next one. Formatting. I think when some students give me their resumes and I nitpick formatting, I think they think I'm being a bit mean. But if I see formatting issues in a resume, I just think that translates to everything that they do, right? There's inconsistencies, they're sloppy. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, this is my favorite slide ever. because I love it when people say they're detail oriented on their resume, but then the formatting's all over the place, or you're using a period in some sentences and not the others. I have well-qualified candidates where a hiring manager will look at it, and just because the formatting or the grammar is incorrect, they'll turn that resume down. So this is super, super important. Your resume is essentially a documented version of you in front of an employer or anyone else. This is essentially you in paper format. So you want it to be a good reflection of who you are and your skill set, and the amount of effort you put behind just keeping it clean and concise. And there's the word skimmable there, right? Like, people have about 10 minutes to go through this quickly. And how much they can take away from you, that's all going to speak of volume. So I cannot emphasize this enough.
Yeah, and it's so easy to make mistakes on these too. I remember writing them, and like I probably spent dozens of hours looking at my resume, only to send it to someone and they'd be like, "Oh, you misspelled like 5 words wrong." It's incredibly easy. And I think someone makes the point, I think it might be you somewhere else. Send it to somebody else afterwards. Send it to a mentor, send it to a family member, get it reviewed by a bunch of people, because they will find things that you just have not been able to see because you're looking at it way too closely.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like any essay you work on in school, you could have looked at it 100 times and you work so hard on it, but you're going to have misses because you just looked at it for too long. So the more people you have and different sets of eyes looking at it is going to be helpful.
Okay, we can go to the next one. Finishing touches. Yeah, so this is to the point we just made. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it exactly covers what we just talked about. And then 2 other small tips. No need to add references upon request. People know that they can do that if they need to. This is a big pet peeve of mine and any of my colleagues in HR, is when you don't save it as a PDF. So a lot of systems actually glitch if you send it in as a Word. But also if you title it resume, it's not a big thing, but from an efficiency standpoint, it makes it so much easier when you actually title your resume your name, because we're filing so many resumes at a time. So it makes it easier for us to locate it. So that's just a small tip.
Do you have any other pet peeves that you haven't listed here?
No, I think it would just be formatting. Formatting's a big pet peeve. Too many acronyms in a resume. And I don't mean acronyms like, SWAT or ON for Ontario, but sometimes very technical acronyms in there. You have to realize that the first set of eyes on your resume is not always a technical hiring manager. It may be HR. So you have to get through HR first for the manager to even see it. So be careful about how many acronyms you use, unless it's very much common knowledge. And then I guess the only other pet peeve is length, like no more than 1 to 2 pages.
Yeah, that's fair. Have you actually gotten a resume that was like 3+ pages?
Yeah, 5 pages. One was 30 because they included all their transcripts and all of that. And that's
amazing.
Different. Yeah, that's different if the job posting has asked for it, but you don't need to include all of that. If they need it, they'll ask for it.
Yeah, we once got a resume from somebody who was an international, I think, student at the time, and he had made a full color magazine that was about 40 pages. It was absolutely epic. He didn't get the job, but it was so entertaining. So we're finished the presentation portion. We're going to switch over to resumes, but I figured we should open it up maybe for questions now. So don't be shy. If anybody wants to ask a specific question about resumes or cover letters now, I'll feel free to open it up. Just unmute yourself or raise your hand, and then we can go from there.
So maybe I can ask a question. So what I've heard is if you're doing a 2-page resume, you kind of have the important stuff on the first page, and the second page is just, I guess, in some way, I guess, extra in a sense. Like, I guess, from an HR perspective, are you really looking for the main content on that first page, and then the second page is just other things that might catch your interest?
Yeah, I think so. I think 1 to 2 pages is the amount you should have. If you don't have enough to get to a second page, that's okay. Don't stretch it. Don't fill it up because you want to show that you have extra. You know, to be honest, I have 10 years of experience. My resume is still 2 pages. What happens is over time, you end up eliminating experiences that are not as relevant. So right now you may have some very junior experiences like, I don't know, helping your dad's business with something, and you're including it because that's all you really have to show and you want to be able to demonstrate some sort of work experience. But over time, as you build your actual work experience and that becomes not irrelevant, you should remove it. So I don't think it's about having, you know, non-essential stuff on the second page. Of course, the beginning of your resume does need to have the most important aspects. So your education, your top experiences, and then later on you can kind of go down to your any extracurriculars or academic projects that may be relevant. But I wouldn't stretch it. If you don't need to include a second page, don't include it.
Okay, thank you. And another quick question is, the bulk, I guess maybe like a third of my resume is really just talking about my PY experience because that's the most significant experience. And is that okay to kind of like really lean on a single experience?
Absolutely. Yeah. If that's all you have, you have to get creative with it and highlight, you know, the most impressive aspects of that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Rena, I see you raise your hand. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I have 2 questions. So the first one is roughly how long do you spend looking at a resume at a first glance?
The very candid answer is about 2 minutes.
Okay, perfect. And then the second question is, do you have a standard like order that you look for? Like, what do you want to see first or at the top of the resume?
Yeah, the top of the resume for a new grad will always be education and then their experience. And then typically for more seasoned applicants, it will be their their experience at the top and education at the bottom. But I think it's great to highlight your education as a new grad at the top. So those would be the 2 things, your experience and your education.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
I think we have 2 questions in the chat. I'll just read the first one from Ellen. She was wondering if there's any major differences between resumes for engineering jobs versus like another industry, like for business. Like, would you structure it differently? Yeah.
Not necessarily. I think engineering jobs may have more technical experiences highlighted. So often for business, they'll just have professional experiences and that's it. For engineering, it may be technical experiences, project experiences, so you can lay it out however, but generally it's still the same flow with having your education at the top, your experiences after, and then, you know, your skills or any sort of volunteering or extracurriculars towards the bottom.
Max, did you say that there was another question in the chat?
That one's been answered by Steve, but I think Yukang has one, and then I also have a follow-up question as well if we've got time for that.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, hi, Tia. I want to ask a question. So, do you think when we're submitting our resume and cover letter, do we also need to submit our recommendation letters? And what kind of aspects are important in the recommendation letters?
Yeah, so it's not necessary to include a recommendation letter. Like I said, it's, you know, you have 2 minutes for someone to read this. If I'm being very generous, maybe 10 minutes. Unless the job posting specifically asks for that, it's not required. One suggestion I do have is if you don't have a LinkedIn account yet, I would strongly suggest creating one, because what can happen over time is your peers and your colleagues from internships can actually do recommendations for you on LinkedIn. So when you link your profile to your resume, and majority of the time recruiters will go on your LinkedIn, they can actually see all the recommendations there consolidated. And then of course, you know, should you get through the interview process and they ask for references, you can provide your recommendation letters at that point. But it's not necessary to include that in your application from the get-go.
Thank you. Also, one question you mentioned, sometimes we can have 2 pages for the resume. However, like for the second page, is it okay if I only have a half of the page, or should we have like whole page for the second page?
That's a great question, and it goes to Luigi's former question around pet peeves. So half a page is okay. If you only have 2 lines on the second page, find a way to condense it into one, but a half a page or 3/4 of a page is perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Tia, question. Oh, Max, go ahead.
Sorry, my main question was just about, like, for somebody who, let's say, has more project experience and work experience, right? And like, let's say the work experience when they're actually employed isn't 100% related to the field. Would you still put work experience above project experience? Would you even segment them into different sections, or would you kind of just combine them and try and order it that way?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it depends. There's a lot of overlap between the project and work experience. For example, if both your work and project experience is at one place, and then now you're just splitting them into 2 different sections, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I would just name it work experience. And then you can always break down into bullet points what were the project related aspects that you gained and the technical skills that you gained from that. If you have a lot of different experiences and it can be cohesively broken down into project versus technical, then at that point it may make sense to split into 2 different sections.
Thank you.
Yeah, how often do you check references?
We check them for every hire at Plenary, so we will only check it for someone in final stages. If they're the preferred candidate, then they would essentially go through a background check and reference check.
Okay. Any more questions for Tia? Even if you think it's silly, feel free just to ask. If not, then we'll jump into the resume reviews, but I'll give everyone a minute if they have a question.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so for like an undergraduate who's not very well connected within the university, do you have any tips on getting like a good reference for hiring?
Yeah, I think that, well, one, it's never too late to build more connections. There's a lot of different ways. When I was in university, I wasn't involved in a lot of different extracurriculars. I worked, so I was in and out of class. There's a lot of different ways where you can volunteer to build that. Even if you don't have a lot of connections, professors are very good if you reach out to them and just let them know that you are looking for a recommendation. If there's something that they want you to do to get that recommendation letter at the end, you can always let them know that you're open to it. But I guess the biggest thing is don't be shy to ask. Sometimes we think people don't want to provide that, but if there are people that you've worked with in a group setting or anything like that, just get resourceful, whether it's TAs or not. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have a question for Tia? Okay, if you do, it's not too late. Feel free just to raise your hand or put it in the chat. We can also have a conversation at the end. So we're going to jump into talking about the resumes that, or a few of the resumes that we received from the submission. So I've made some notes on these, and Tia, I'm assuming you went through these. Oh, actually, I know you did. So we can just have a conversation about it. So I'm looking at the first resume 1 is what it was called. We made sure just to block up the names to anonymize the resumes. I actually thought this was a really good resume. And I thought the information here was good. It's very impressive. Cool that this person's also a DJ. I only had some minor comments. Again, I kind of go to the objective statement, but to your point, maybe it's not needed. What were your first thoughts?
I completely agree with you. I actually didn't have that many comments on this resume. I thought it was well laid out, straight to the point. direct. So yeah, very similar thoughts to you.
I did have a comment about maybe introducing some quantitative results like we had talked about. There's a framework that I typically tell mentees to look after. It's called STAR. Like, what was the situation? What's the task? What was the action? What was the result? It's to your earlier point, Tia, about having quantitative results. So under this experience being a research intern, and if you can't find quantitative results, maybe the other thing you can do is like, what's the so what? Like, what's the, why is this, and why do you think this was important? What did your work actually produce? Because that shows, what the impact was, and really, you're hired for impact, not for running processes. But it also demonstrates that you can communicate what the results of a process were, and communication skills are very much valued at a company. Would you agree with that, Tia?
Absolutely, yeah. You nailed it.
Yeah, but yeah, I thought this was really good. So Tia, if let's say this person were to apply for plenary, would you suggest that these be tailored to the position, or do you think this could be submitted as is?
I would say that it would need to be tailored to the position for sure. And back to your point, I think that the bullet points here are good, but probably can be thought so more critically to understand, exactly what you mentioned earlier. There's a couple of things otherwise as well, which I mentioned before around using acronyms. I know BOMs is pretty obvious, but just writing it out. And then I think on the second page at the top, yeah, so the last line here where it says overseeing the exec team, it's very important in resume writing that you write the full words. We use exec team all the time, but that's just a small catch that I'd write out the full word. Another point is around bullet points, which we'd mentioned earlier. So under that specific experience, there's about 5 or 6, and then the work experiences on the top have about 1 to 2 bullet points. So having a bit more consistency with that is better.
Yeah. Anything else on this, Tia, that you think is worth noting?
The only other piece, and this is a very common mistake on resumes, is to use the correct tenses. So if you are in a role currently, you want to use the present tense. So for example, if it's a role right now in the present, you want to use compose, arrange, and remix music. If it's a role in the past, you want to use the past tense. So tenses get very mixed up in resumes. It's important to be mindful of that, so it just has a more clean look.
Yeah, and to one of your earlier points, it's important to be a bit creative with how you detail your responsibilities. You don't want to just say responsible for or performed. You want to say, to like referencing this particular resume, contacted, taught, translated, composing, participated, analyzed. There's a lot of things that you can talk about, but you do have to put some thought into it.
Yeah, and even another example is under Frost Group Leader. Worked alongside other leaders during orientation week to create a positive, inclusive environment. That's great, and that is a huge part of being a Frost Group Leader, but how did you do that? Getting into some specifics around what did you actually really do to create an inclusive environment? Because I can guarantee you that in a phone screen, they may ask you that question. So being able to just add a bit more color to that can go a long way.
Yeah, and when I interview people, I definitely refer to the resume and I press them on these just to see how much of it is BS and how much detail they can really go into. Even to put some pressure just to see how they react to it. Like, okay, you said you participated in the leadership training, but how much did you actually do? Like, what result did it have? Without being flippant, but just trying to see how much of this were they actually responsible for. So it's important to kind of toe the line to your point about being factual, but making yourself look good, right? Because you will be called out on it, potentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's only one more thing I wanted to mention. It's somewhere up there around, I think, scholarships or aids, under awards, where it says various awards. yeah, where it says over, you know, dollar amount worth of scholarships and bursaries, I think in that one, it would be good to indicate some of the ones that you have received. You know, just one or two names even. So you can even write received throughout high school, including X and X, just to give them a bit more color into what specific awards you did qualify for.
Yeah, absolutely. Max, I think someone raised their hand. Did you happen to catch the name?
Yeah, it was Aramuga. If you can feel free to unmute yourself and speak.
Sure. So one of the things I kind of heard is that I guess employers don't value, I guess, extracurricular experience and awards as much as they do work experience. So I guess if you were to prioritize, you would obviously, would you say you'd prioritize work experience?
Absolutely, yeah. Awards, I will clarify, they do care about awards. I mean, if you won something in grade 5, probably not, but anything high school and over, especially through university, I would leave that in there. With this resume, actually, it's done a very good job in balancing out more technical and I guess professional work experiences, but also highlighting this individual obviously has a keen interest in the music aspect. So I think that it's fine to leave it in there, because when I look at this resume at the very beginning, it's still very clearly highlighted to me the engineering related experiences this person has. And then as you get towards the bottom, they highlight sort of their personal interests as part of their overall experience, which is great. As this person continues to gain more experience, they're probably going to have to take that out at some point. They're just going to run out of room. And you know, maybe they'll just have one sentence on not being an interest. But if you are applying to the music industry, for example, I would definitely keep that in there because it's so relatable and it's so transferable.
And how far back would you go? Like how many years back would you go on a resume?
No more than 10 years. Less if it's not relevant. So, you know, at one point I included all my retail experience when I was early on in my career. At this point, I'm not going to include any of it because I just have much more relevant experience. So I think it's all about relevancy. Because you're a recent grad or an upcoming grad, you're probably going to keep a lot of this in there until you're able to build that.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, actually, one thing I want to add to this is I like the fact that this person, you know, showed additional experiences and like those experiences were around music. It does humanize this person. And I think it's really easy to get lost in showing technical experiences and work experiences. I personally like to see, you know, a bit of personality in a resume. I wouldn't say it's a main focus, but I think it's a nice to have. Would you say that as well, Tia?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it depends on the organization. An organization like the one we work for right now, it's key. We want to make sure that this person has other interests outside of it. And that's kind of why I mentioned that resume did a great job by putting the most relevant work experience at the top, but then used that extra space at the bottom to highlight other interests that they're obviously very keen on.
Yeah, completely agree. So let's go to resume 3. I'm gonna have to reload resume 2. Tia, do you want to kick off with any thoughts that you had when you went through this?
Yeah, I thought that this one was good as well. I think that I mentioned this earlier, but putting your education at the top is great. Once you're in university, it's not as necessary to include your high school experience. You can for this individual. They obviously did well in a number of contests and they wanted to highlight that. That's great. And going down to the professional experiences, there is one thing that I noticed. Oh, if you can go up for a sec. Yeah. We had the same thing highlighted, I think, where it says assisted the sales manager with stuff. So again, there can be a tendency to almost write like you're in a conversation, but that doesn't come off very professional. So kind of checking your verbiage to make sure it's as professional as possible. So a very quick change to that could be assisted the sales manager with deliverables, including but not limited to, instead of stuff. What are your thoughts?
I thought the same thing. I thought it was good. It was succinct. I like the layout. Very easy to follow. Very concise. I had nitpicky formatting comments. I think the dates were, like, for me, slightly hard to follow. I would have preferred if it said, August 2019 to December 2019. But again, nitpicky stuff. Yeah, I think stuff comes across here as a little bit too informal. And this actually reminded me of something. One of my mentees had asked me, like, what is professionalism? Like, how could you summarize what being professional is? And I struggled with that a bit because, I think in a resume, you don't want to be robotic, but you want to be, formal. So not using slang. Imagine this were a fancy dinner party, but on a resume. So, try not to use faux pas, again, slang, or, spelling words like you would on, social media or something like that, right? How would you define it?
Putting me on the spot. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think it's that classic elevator pitch, right? Like, if you're in elevator with, I don't know, a CEO of a company who may just give you a job, how would you present yourself? And that's exactly what you would do in your resume. Is you want to put your best version out there, not how you're going to be chatting with your friends, but someone that you will have a professional relationship with, right? So yeah, that's a good question. It's actually tough to describe what professional means.
Yeah, it's something that you learn when you're doing it.
For sure.
And that's why it's important for students to reach out to those who have some experience, to contact your mentors, because they'll be able to tell you, right? And so I think maybe the takeaway there is, if you have a question, document it, then approach your mentors or approach somebody with industry experience, and they'll be able to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely trial and error. And even with resumes, it's never going to be perfect. My resume is not perfect. It's a work of art. It's how much effort you put into it to try to reflect it the best you can at where you are in your career at that point.
Yeah, agreed. Do any of the students have questions on something in this resume that we should talk about, or any questions generally before we move on?
I actually had a couple of comments, if there's no questions, just on the volunteer experiences.
Yeah.
So just little things like under volunteer experiences, it says volunteered at Restore. We already know that because Restore is put on the heading, so I would just delete that. This is very valuable real estate, so whatever you're putting on there, try not to be repetitive if it's pretty obvious. Even on the last line, that last bullet of that first line where it says fundraise enough to build 6 houses, which is great, but received 3 thank you notes. I would probably take out the received 3 thank you notes. That's something you can talk about in an interview. But the way that can come across is, well, are you doing it for that thank you? So you want to just focus on kind of the objective aspect. There's nothing wrong with that, but just to save some and keep it as concise as possible, I would actually shorten it. And then you can always mention that in an interview that, it was really rewarding. You got thank you notes from the impacted families or whatnot. And then I think just at the bottom where it says skills and interest, where it says interest in school debate team, in school quantitative finance team, I'm being nitpicky here. Those are great, but just a quick way to turn that around into a more impactful sentence is a contributing member, an active participant in the university debate team and quantitative finance team. Because when I read that, I don't even know if it's from their high school or from the university. So just adding a bit more specifics to that is helpful.
Yeah. It's also very, I would also say that my concern would be that, this isn't capitalized, but everything else is. So it does seem a bit sloppy. Again, nitpicky comment though.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody had a question about fonts, Tia, but hypothetical question. You see the best resume ever, but it's in Comic Sans. What do you do?
If everything else is okay and formatting's great and it's perfect, I'll overlook it. It's definitely not the preferred font. You want to just keep it simple. Keep it simple, clean. People get very funky and creative with their layouts, and now if you're getting into interior design or graphic design and that's your job, and that's how you're reflecting your portfolio, it's a totally different equation, but just keep it as simple and neutral as possible.
Yeah, I would say, I completely agree. I would say content is king.
Yeah.
Like it really, the format doesn't matter as long as it looks clean. So I'd say there's a lot of formats that can work. There are a lot of formats that are overly distracting, but regardless, what's really important is that the content there really demonstrates that you know what the position is, you have applicable experience, or you have transferable skills and you're able to communicate it appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just checking to see if there's any more comments. Okay, let's jump into the last resume. So I had comments on these, Tia, but they've, I think they've just deleted. My initial thought was that it was formatted well when I saw this first section, but as I was scrolling down, I did notice a couple things that, you know, that would bother me. So for example, the fact that these don't have bullet points, the fact that this is bolded, and it's not aligned with these, that was a formatting issue for me. This random bullet point that I found here, it comes across as a bit sloppy, formatting wise.
Yeah, I would say my original thought is, if I actually look at this, there's some good stuff here. It probably just requires proper formatting and to be candid, rewording. So if we go to the top, even the summary, that is something that I would really caution on using fluff words. So I think at the top it says, you can't see it on screen right now, but it says, you know, good at computer technology and responsible and patient. So those are all fluff words. Obviously the intent there is so good and you want to demonstrate that you're this willing person that can do the job well. But it's really not adding much value to the resume, because those are traits and skills that almost every person is going to say they have. So how do you really differentiate who you are? And there's only so many adjectives there are out there, right? You are eventually going to get to a point where someone else is probably still using that, but you want it to be a little bit more unique than just those characteristics.
Yeah. I see someone's raised their hand. Go ahead.
So earlier on, you said when you're applying a job, you should be tailoring your resume to the job. So should I use the exact keyword that's in the job description?
Yes, only if you feel.
And the cover letter as well.
Yeah, so I would only use that exact keyword if it. So one mistake people do is, when I've given that advice, is they take that keyword and then they like throw it up all over the resume. Don't do that. You can use the keyword if it actually makes sense and you have that experience. You can also sometimes find synonyms for something similar so that it kind of relays a message. But yeah, absolutely. Feel free to infuse a couple of those keywords in your resume, as long as you're not being too repetitive with it.
And I guess, is it about like hitting all of the points in the job description, or would it be, you know, maybe focusing on a few ones and kind of elaborating within the cover letter?
I think it would be the ones that resonate with your experience the most. If you happen to have all 10 points, great, put it in there. But if there are, you know, 6 out of the 10 that you have very strong experience or skills in, I would definitely emphasize that.
Okay, thank you.
I also, so to your earlier point, Tia, about rewording, when I read this, like my first question was, you know, these both look like they're relevant to a company called SoSuite. Why are they on separate bullet points? Right? This could have been probably labeled as, you know, one company instead of different roles, and then within that company, you could talk about what your experiences were instead of listing your I'd say your role, you know, generally.
Yeah, exactly. And if you actually look at their professional experience down in their resume, they actually talk about So Sweet Bakery again. So I would actually consolidate all of that and put the name of the bakery, and then in bullet points write down the project specific experience, technical experience, or whatever it is, because it seems like they have quite a bit of experience within this particular organization. So I would just consolidate it rather than breaking it down on project experience and professional experience. It gets a little confusing.
Yeah, I would agree. Oh, shoot. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can.
So apologies, but my my internet connection just went down. So, Tia, do you have the resume open? Do you have any other comments on it? I'll try and pull it up while you're doing that.
Yeah, I also in the project experience, there were a couple of lines that said, you know, completed this independently or person in charge. I would just remove all of that. It's just filler words. Not, if you're writing bullet points about what you did, it'll probably be obvious to the person reading whether this is an independent assignment or a supervisory assignment. And then I think there was one line around, oh, okay. So under skills, certification, and other, the person put their skill as office. So it's just catching little things like that. Like, you know, obviously this person means office with regards to Microsoft and PowerPoint and Excel, but actually indicating Office Suite, and just being mindful about little catches like that. And then I think Luigi brought up earlier just the formatting. So we see the dates above, but then in this next professional experience, the dates are indented in a different way. So overall, I think this resume has good content, but probably the formatting, the consistency, and just rewording some of the experiences, which can be tricky, right? So I think that oftentimes when you don't have, you know, direct professional experiences, you kind of think, to Max's point earlier about working at a pizza shop, like how much can you stretch it? But truly think critically about what have you done there? Are there any projects that you supported? Any sort of IT implementations, any training you provided? Those are all such valuable skills that say so much about you and your experience. So get creative with it. Be honest. Obviously, don't stretch it too much, because they will ask you about that and then you won't know how to answer. But yeah, really think about every experience and ask yourself, what did I bring to the table here? What did I gain? And your job is to be able to summarize and highlight that in, you know, a couple of bullet points.
Yeah, and I would just echo Tia, like your point about it needing to be rewritten. I would think that this resume probably needs quite a bit of work. Like I would remove ellipses. That's not, you know, I'm not really sure what's that trying to convey, but you know, you typically also, to your earlier point about presenting what you did, you respond in a past tense. So instead of I take responsibility, you would say responsible for, you know, something along those lines. So I think, you know, this resume would probably need a couple more version edits before it's ready to go in front of an employer. Because if I saw this, I probably wouldn't even, like, regardless of the experience, unless it was incredible, I probably wouldn't consider it.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, just under operation intern, where it says towards the end, finish the task rapidly, automatically, and effectively. That entire sentence can be changed into something like, you know, supported a new restaurant by managing the operational and technological capabilities. Manage the back end of online delivery platform to improve overall efficiency. So it's really, I'm really saying the same thing that this person has written, and it's good experience. It's just rewording it so that it gets the message across very clearly and well. And even below where it says some Adobe software, like never use some of this. If you're going to write some, be very specific. So what specifically in Adobe software? Is it specific, creative InDesign tool, Photoshop. What is it that you actually have a skill in? Yeah,
agreed. And not to be overly harsh on the resume. Obviously, we want everyone to have their fair shake at an interview, and when the resume is being considered, it's best that we provide this commentary now, as opposed to you not being considered for a job. So don't take it to heart. Just use the resources you have on hand. Use the Engineering Career Center as much as possible, and then talk to people who do have industry experience. Put the resume in front of them. Everyone wants to help. So don't be shy to ask them for 5 minutes to review their resume. Anything else on this one, Tia, or in general, based on some of the other ones that you may have reviewed?
Let me just take a look. I think that's it. A very common question I have with new grads or people still in school is, do I need to include my GPA? You don't actually need to include your GPA. Specifically for anyone that also has done schooling internationally, they often will break down how their grades were assessed. Unfortunately, that people in a different country don't know how to read that, so it doesn't actually add more value to your resume. So you don't need to include that, unless of course you are specifically applying to a new grad opportunity where they've indicated that they want to see what your GPA is. Oftentimes, opportunities that are catered specifically towards new graduates, especially with big firms like banks and things like that, they will want to see your GPA. So, obviously if it's specifically asked for that, include it, but you definitely don't need to.
Got it. Yeah, go ahead. I see you raise your hand, Armunga.
So is the GPA just a kind of cutoff, or I guess how is GPA used essentially?
Yeah, so GPAs may be used if it's specifically indicated in a job posting, and they may actually have that as part of their screening requirement. So they're looking for, I don't know, I'll just put 3.5 out of 4 on there. Their system may actually not accept your resume if it doesn't meet that criteria. They may do it for different reasons. Most companies, however, don't have that rule. They're very flexible. They care more about that individual and recognize that a GPA doesn't, speak everything about a student or an applicant. But for ones that actually do list that as a requirement, they often, may have it as a pretty strict screening requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Tia or for us or generally about resumes? If you prefer to put it in the chat, feel free. Max, Rena, how about you guys? Do you have anything that you wanted to ask Tia or me? Tia, you can ask Tia. She's a professional. I'm just a worker bee.
I think you mentioned it earlier, but I used to have questions about how effective adding color or certain stylizations was to your resume. But I think you mentioned earlier that, if you're applying for a technical job compared to a graphical job, right? Then it's better to just keep it as mute as possible.
Yeah, you can use color, use a navy, or I've seen a dark green. That's fine. Maybe don't use a hot pink. But I know there's a lot of fancy layouts out there now. If you even go on Pinterest and you look at CV layout, it's overwhelming. They're very fancy. There's professional companies that do that now. You don't need to do that at all. And, oftentimes people ask, well, should I actually contact a professional resume maker and just have them do it? If you feel like that is something that's really important to you, go for it. It's not at all necessary. If I am hiring for someone in design, so at Plenary, we do have design jobs. And when I do have an applicant with a really nice designed resume, that's very relatable to their role. And so I will look out for that. But generally for most jobs, a simple, concise, clean layout is totally fine.
Awesome, got you. I think there's also another question in the chat from Luca, or sorry, before that from Kieran, and he wanted to know, does it make sense to split up your experience into a project and work experience?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So I'm just reading the question. I've seen a relatively common trend of when someone doesn't have that much work experience, they add a project section to talk more in depth about school projects. Definitely, if you don't have enough work experience, that is such a great way to highlight skills that you've learned. I highly recommend that if work experience is something you don't have as much of. The one thing I will say is employers are fairly understanding. We know, we've all been there where we haven't had that work experience ourselves. And it can feel intimidating to think, well, how am I going to get a job if I don't have work experience? But I can't gain work experience unless someone gives it to me. So I think that's where you really leverage any sort of volunteering experiences that are available to you, school projects, even if it's something that you're doing as a part-time job, if there's any projects that can uplift your skills that way, helping out with technology or whatever the case it is. All of those little things matter, and they're skills you can definitely add to your resume.
I think we have one more question from Luca. If we had made a professional website that has more details than a resume, what would be the best way to include the website into the resume?
Yeah, I think you can include the website anywhere. Typically, what most people do with their LinkedIn profile, for example, is at the top where our name and contact information is. We'll just add the LinkedIn URL. So you can do the exact same thing with your website. If you have any sort of portfolio, highly encourage you to include that link as long as your website looks professional and it's clearly laid out. Definitely add that in there. They will check it out and it will only expand on your work. There's another question on, is it common, as you said earlier, for employers to look up the candidate on LinkedIn? It is very common. I will say in the HR world, they are trying to move away from that practice. But I think a huge part of that is it makes a person more human. So if I look at an applicant, I'll go on LinkedIn, I want to look at, the university they went to. It's a lot easier for us to actually read it on LinkedIn versus a paper format. So that's why there's a tendency to gravitate towards your profile. As I mentioned earlier, LinkedIn has the ability to also show your recommendations at the bottom. It has the ability to show any shared connections we might have and things like that. So it is a tendency. If you don't have LinkedIn, it's not a big deal, but I do recommend it because when employers are specifically looking for new graduates, that's how they'll actually go onto LinkedIn and they'll look for anyone graduating in 2021 or whatever the year is, and they will contact you. So it could be a job opportunity for you in that sense.
And on LinkedIn, it kind of hides the, I guess, projects and extracurriculars. It's not shown as prominently as that work experience section. So can you put, I guess, extracurriculars under the work experience, I guess, subheading?
Yeah, you can do that. And just because they go on your LinkedIn, it doesn't mean they're not reading your resume. They'll still look at it. If you'd like to add the extracurriculars on your LinkedIn to keep it very consistent, you can do that. You don't need to. They'll still look at both just to see what's on your LinkedIn that may be missed out on your resume, what's on your resume that may not be on your LinkedIn. And sometimes it's also for consistency to make sure that everything kind of lines up.
Okay, thank you.
I would also note that I think once resumes advance past the initial screening round and some people are notified that they would be interviewing this person, in cases where I'm interviewing that person, I do typically search them on Google and see what pops up. And I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but I will look at other social feeds if they're available, not to creep, but just to understand, to get a sense of this person's personality, right? And once they've passed the initial screening and you're considering working with this person, you want to make sure that you know, they have a personality that jives with the overall culture of the company, and I know it's someone you want to work with. And so at that point, you're just taking data points that are available to you. So the takeaway there is, you know, be careful of what you post online, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. But you know, but don't obsess too much over it. You know, I wouldn't read into specific things, but yeah, just don't be. You can assume that if it's available to us, we would probably look at it.
Yeah, and just on the flip side, when I have candidates that are interviewing, if Luigi is interviewing them, I will send them a link to his LinkedIn profile, just to create that, for them to give them the opportunity to understand his background and his profile. So it is a two-way street. It's not just a one-way street. And then another question came up again about LinkedIn is, should you show all your experiences or just make it concise and select several typical experiences? Your LinkedIn should match your resume as much as possible. It's essentially just a virtual version that gets across to several employers versus your resume. You're selectively deciding who you want to send it to. So they should very much match each other. To one of the points that was made earlier, while LinkedIn doesn't have the exact same format, I can't show my extracurriculars or my project, that's okay. But when it comes to your work experiences, it should essentially be the same, because if you're trying to tailor your experiences to match engineering, for example, you're going to want to do that on your LinkedIn as well. Then a question from Luca, in terms of applying through email, what are your thoughts on following up, say in 2 weeks if we haven't heard back? So mixed feelings with this one. I get about 1,000 applicants on average per role. At any given time, we're a mid-sized firm, so I may have 10 roles open. If I had that many candidates following up with me, there's no way I can get back to them. And it's not that I don't want to, it's just it's not feasible. So if there's a role that you're very keen on, sure, in 2 weeks, you can send that person an email. Don't take it personally if you don't get a response back. The volumes are just very high. And some of the larger companies will just have automated responses. So they'll actually email you saying, we've received your application. If you don't hear, you only hear from us if you're qualified. And unfortunately, that's just the way it works. I know you put in a lot of effort to apply, and to not even hear anything can be disheartening. But, you know, give it a shot, send an email. Don't take it personally if they don't respond. If you're shortlisted or qualified, you'll definitely hear from them.
I would add on to say that just take comfort in that the more you do, the more likely you will be to advance to the next round. It's just a law of large numbers thing. Assume that the average acceptance rate is 5%. You're going to apply to 20, you're going to get 1. So yeah, don't be disheartened if you don't hear back or if you don't get the position. It's just completely natural. Tia, I had a question for you about cold emails and about applying to jobs or roles that don't have a posting. Have you ever received an email, that wasn't in response to a posting that ended up in a position filled?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of that. A lot of people are not comfortable with it, and it takes courage, but it only demonstrates good things to a prospective employer. So you taking the time to reach out, to introduce yourself, there may not be a role available for that next year, but maybe a year from there, they may think of you. And I've definitely done that with candidates. So, if you are doing cold emails, make sure that it's very thoughtful, that it's not something that is cookie cutter that you're sending en masse to a number of people. Make sure that you actually show your interest as to why you want to work for that specific firm on that person's team.
Yeah, good point. Like I had gotten the job at Plenary via a cold email, and I had tried a couple. Most people don't respond at all. I'd say like your odds are actually really, really low. But I think if you do get a response, it's probably a good sign, because they're taking the time to respond to you. They're clearly interested in what you're talking about, and there's something there. So I'd say again, that's another thing that's a numbers game.
Yeah, and to your point about applying for a number of roles and not hearing back, sometimes it is definitely a numbers game. But if you have applied to a significant number of roles and not even got a single callback, take a look at your resume again, see how you can tweak it, how you can always make it better. At least, you know, you can do your part in making sure that you're putting the best profile out there. And specifically, if you don't have as many connections and, you know, depending on the economic climate, those are times where you especially want to do the cold emails and reach out and have a bit of that personal touch and get in touch directly with someone that has that hiring capability.
Yeah, completely agree. So I think we're just approaching the end. If anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question now, please do so, but I'll just start wrapping up. So Tia, I thought that was great. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to look over resumes and provide comments, especially as thoughtful as they were. And thanks for providing the general tips and resume advice that, you know, students really need, especially during this time when, you know, they're fraught with midterms and applications. So again, really appreciate it. I thought it was great, and I appreciated the real good feedback, the candid feedback on the resumes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for having me. And there were a lot of great questions that were asked. For those who submitted their resume, thanks so much for doing that. And yeah, no, happy to be here tonight. Yeah,
thanks so much. And I want to say thanks to Steve and to Max and to Lindsay and Rena and everyone who helped put together the event. And for the students, you know, hopefully you were able to get some advice or some benefit out of this. As always, these talks are recorded, so you can always reference them later. There's a lot of good material in here. And if any of you have questions or follow-up questions, please reach out to us at the leadership team. Max, do you want to throw up the last slides? Maybe if you can, that would be good. If not, don't worry. Actually, let's see if I can. Actually, you got it. Perfect. So as always, just reach out to us if you have any questions. And again, thanks for all your participation and look forward to the next event. Tia, thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
You too. Take care.